So England lost the men's football final of the Euros, and to many football fans like myself, and just even a lot of ordinary people, that's very disappointing. Even people who don't watch football, I think, at all, often get invested in the Euros and the World Cup and things. And then, you know, in South America, the Copa America, I think is a similar deal. But sadly, yes, we didn't win, but we got to the final, which was amazing. And I think this team is a team that we can be so incredibly proud of, not just for their actions on the pitch, and they are a formidable set of players who set aside ego and, you know, play as a real team. And Gareth Southgate is an amazing manager, and, you know, I think if anyone had said England are going to get to the final of the Euros, we wouldn't have believed them, and we would have been, you know, if someone offered that to us on a plate, that or just let it run its course, we'd be like, yes, we'll have that, you know. So they've done an amazing job, and like I said, you know, yes, on the pitch, but also off the pitch, you know, they've really represented our country very well, especially people like Marcus Rashford, with his campaigns against childhood poverty. So it does seem, at first glance, so out of character, where so many people in this country have sent horrific abuse at the players, especially the black and mixed race players who've received a massive influx of racist abuse online. And it, you know, Saka deactivated his Instagram account for a little while. Marcus Rashford tweeted that he'd received over 70 racial slurs in a really short period of time, one of which was from a teacher, because he checked their profile on Twitter. But he said, you know, you can't make me feel as bad as I already have made myself feel. And that is incredibly sad, and he posted a very heartfelt thing on Instagram and Twitter. And, you know, a lot of the players a lot of the white players have backed up the black players who were getting all this abuse. And it's particularly inspired by the fact that the three players who missed the penalties in the penalty shootout were Saka and Rashford and Sancho, of course none of whom are white. And all the racists just came out of the woodworks to absolutely hound them for it and call them despicable things, and really just prove themselves to be the lowest of the low. So that might seem out of left field, that might seem out of character for the fans of a football team, but unfortunately England and many other countries have a lot of form on this. We have a big problem with racism in our society, and a big problem with racism in football, and people who don't acknowledge that, people who've been telling us that there isn't a problem with racism in this country, people like Lawrence Fox over the past few years, really need to just shut up now, because it's so clear. And I know they'll find ways to make excuses for it, and they'll say, oh well, these were bot accounts, or this was like, you know, 0.1% of the population or something. But clearly we have a problem with racism if players are getting an influx of racist hate comments from people in their country. And even if they weren't players, you know, even if they weren't really successful, really fundamentally decent and accomplished athletes and philanthropists, they still don't deserve that. You know, everyone is deserving of respect and not to be called these horrendous things and abused and harassed and things. Marcus Rashford's mural, I believe it's a mural in Manchester, was defaced with racist hate speech. That was covered up, and then lots of new things by fans were put on it, which was a lovely thing to see. Proof that there are a lot of good people in this country. And then a street artist actually redid the parts of the mural that had been defaced, so it's fine now as of recording this. But politicians have obviously commented on this. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, and Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, have talked about it. And Priti Patel said this. She said, "I am disgusted that England players who have given so much for our country this summer have been subject to vile racist abuse on social media." And of course a lot of people were slightly confused, because her previous stances on the England football team, on anti-racism in general, have been somewhat you know, somewhat offensive. And offensive, I don't mean like, you know, my feelings are hurt. I mean offensive as in she's kind of been on the attack mode against anti-racists rather than kind of joining them in vocalising support for a more equal society and being compassionate to refugees. I mean, we obviously know she has a very, very negative view of refugees, and she's ordered the police to, you know, arrest and deport refugees many times. She's had ideas for creating artificial waves to capsize migrant rafts and boats. And, you know, she said with glee how happy she was about us getting rid of freedom of movement. Getting rid of a freedom is usually a sign that you're on the wrong side of history, but whatever. So she tweeted that. Tyrone Mings, a member of the England team, he's a fantastic player. He responded to her and ratioed her in truly spectacular fashion. This is what he said. "You don't get to stoke the fire at the beginning of the tournament by labelling our anti-racism message as gesture politics and then pretend to be disgusted when the very thing we're campaigning against happens." And do I need to say any more? I mean, he put it so perfectly. And Gary Neville on I think it was on Sky News, but he was on the news, and he was talking about he was one of the mainstream kind of outlets, and he was talking about Boris Johnson and how he called Muslim women letterboxers and said they look like bank robbers. And you know, this is a guy who's called black people pickaninnies with watermelon smiles. This is a guy who has said in the past how much he thinks actually we should return to British colonialism, which is responsible for the deaths of, at the very least, tens of millions, arguably hundreds of millions of people. You know, many of whom died in the most grotesque and painful deaths you could imagine because of British colonialism. So this is a guy who has a terrible record on it, and of course when he made those comments about Muslim women, Islamophobic hate crimes increased by 375% immediately afterwards. So clearly his words have had devastating consequences for anyone who isn't white in this country. And of course his actions have had devastating consequences for white people as well, saying homophobic things and you know, policies that fundamentally hurt working class people in general, you know. So Gary Neville, you know, had a right go at him, and you know, I think it's clear that there is an enormous divide in this country, an enormous divide between what politicians are willing to say and what they're willing to do, right? And that's not news to anyone, really, is it? But Priti Patel and Boris Johnson have stoked the fires of this, as Tyrone Ming says, for a long time. You know, they have dog whistled on so many different occasions in so many different ways, and this Conservative government just a few years ago presided over the hostile environment, where people who had lived in this country for years and years and years were deported. The Windrush scandal. The Windrush generation, which the United Kingdom's government invited to come here after World War II to help rebuild our country, after the devastation of the Blitz, was subject to racism all through that time. And then finally, as things seemed like they were starting to get better in the 2000s and the 2010s, obviously they weren't perfect, but they were starting to improve, suddenly the government starts deporting people from the Windrush generation, or people who are descended from members of the Windrush generation. It's mind-boggling that this government can claim to be anti-racist. And this, I hope, is the beginning of a real reckoning for British society, because we have failed to deal with racism because we will not acknowledge it exists. Well, it's clearly there. It's clearly there. It doesn't matter if we are one of the most tolerant societies. Well, we are one of the most tolerable, I suppose. You know, there's a lot that you have to tolerate when you come here. But, I mean, we may be one of the most tolerant countries in the world. Still doesn't change the fact that we have these huge issues. So I'm really happy that they've been called out for their hypocrisy, the politicians, on this. And don't get me wrong, you know, Labour certainly isn't smelling of roses either. You know, they're not not exactly coming out of this looking fantastic either, because they've recently just allowed Islamophobic guy Trevor Phillips, I believe his name was, into the party, so that's great. But there are a lot of good people in this country, and while it's a shameful time to be English, it's also very heartwarming to see all of the responses to it, and the fact that people are starting to realise, hang on a minute, these politicians are saying this isn't a problem, and they are in many ways stirring up that hatred and that fear and that bigotry and that viewing other people as less than human. And the media are to blame as well. The Sun talking about with that lovely headline, "Oh, we stand with our boys," and racism's bad, and they have repeatedly portrayed people of colour, especially immigrants, as subhuman on many different occasions and as a threat to British society. The idea that England is a country only for white people has been pervading the media for a long time, and it's still there underneath the surface. And every now and then it pops up its ugly head. And look, this is what happens when we don't hold politicians to good standards. They allow this kind of thing to go on. And luckily the government is saying they're going to take action. They're going to try and get these people prosecuted if they can. And there's going to be... Boris Johnson's going to have a meeting with people in positions of influence within major tech companies. But that's not getting to the root of the issue, and this government won't. So, very, very upsetting. But our England team, we have nothing to be angry about. We can be incredibly proud of them, and I hope that this is the start of a real catalyst for change in our country, where we really understand, yes, there's a problem, yes, we have to face it, and yes, we can tackle it together and make a more equal and more fair society.